Hi, my name is Paige Adele, and this is my speech on civic engagement. Over the past decades, there have been many protests that fight for different issues and controversies. Protesting calls for change in society and can be successful. Take a look at the March for Our Lives movement that has been fighting for gun control in the response to the Parkland school shooting in Florida. This organization gathered data from the time they started in 2018 to 2020 in an impact report. According to this report, since their founding, 180 gun violence prevention laws have passed in states across the country. As seen in this example, protesting can be effective, and it represents how it's an important aspect of society, especially a democratic one, that allows people to fight against something deemed socially wrong. When people protest, they can work together to create changes in society, which is a major component of civic engagement. This concept of civic engagement can have different definitions based on an individual's perspective of life and interests. Two authors, Richard Adler and Judy Goggin, narrowed down the various definitions to a universal one, which states that civic engagement is how an active citizen participates in the life of a community in order to improve conditions for others or to help shape the community's future. It is important to know what this concept is, as it will help us understand why it plays such a crucial role in our society, which brings me to the topic of my presentation, that protesting is one of the best ways to participate in civic engagement. The first point I would like to address is that protesting can lead to positive impacts for participants. When an individual participates in a protest, they are in a sea of people who are fighting for the same issues they believe in. Not only are there shared beliefs, but there can also be shared passion. With all that energy, an individual can feel empowered and feel like they are part of something. Furthermore, participating in forms of civic engagement can be beneficial, especially for younger people, in the sense that it can make for a more positive future. For instance, Parissa Ballard, a developmental psychologist, and her colleagues found that early civic engagement is associated with positive health outcomes later in life that relate to improved mental health, greater educational attainment, and higher personal and household outcomes, from the Rethinking Civic Engagement article. Participating in protests, which is a form of civic engagement, can lead to positive impacts on younger people's lives. Another thing to think about is the skills people can develop from participating or even organizing events such as protests. Skills in leadership, organization, and dedication can be developed through participation or organization of protests, as there are a lot of components that are involved. Those participating can develop social and interpersonal skills as they interact with others in the crowd or even those who organized it. The development of those skills have a positive impact on those who participate, which in turn prepares them to help others in society. This brings me to my next point, which is how protesting can bring awareness to an issue within a community or society as a whole. There are so many different forms of protest, and there are also several different purposes. In some cases, combining different forms of protest that serve different purposes can increase the effectiveness of the protest. One example of this was the National Indigenous Mobilization Campaign in Brazil that used multiple forms of protest with different purposes, such as fundraising, gaining publicity through press conferences, putting pressure on political leaders through meetings, and creating social media to spread information. With the various forms of protest that serve different purposes, there is an increased chance it will be more effective. One of the specific purposes protesting can serve is, quote, distributing information to the wider public in order to raise awareness about the cause or the situation that is the subject of the protest, end quote. From Conceptualizing Social Protest. This can be seen in the summer of 2020, where there were multiple Black Lives Matter protests that occurred. Many protests that are successful and end up taking front and center in conversations, which was something the Black Lives Matter movement was accomplishing that summer. In the article, Do Protests Even Work? By Zainab Tafeki, the movement, following the Black Lives Matter protests in the summer of 2020, polls reported that 40% of Americans supported the movement in 2016, whereas in 2020, that number increased to about 66%. Furthermore, in 2020, 76% of Americans thought racism was a big problem, which was a 26% increase from 2015. Meaning only about 50% of Americans thought it was a big problem in 2015. Overall, the Black Lives Matter was a great example showing that when protests succeed and draw attention to an issue, people's opinions can change and push a movement in a specific direction. If an issue wasn't known, then there wouldn't be as much momentum for change. However, with more people knowing the specific issue, those people's perspectives can be enlightened or even changed, which can encourage them to help fight and make changes through different channels. One of those channels being a political level. Which brings me to my last point, which is how protesting can allow for changes on a political level. As described in the previous point, the more attention an issue has, the more likely it will change people's perspectives. More people urging for change can result on the political level through either state governments, federal governments, etc. For instance, following the Parkland shooting, a study was done to show the relationship between state government action and the protest activity within the state. The specific protest being focused on is the controversy over gun control. One of the results from the study showed that, quote, the average marginal effect of an increase of 1,000 participants in gun control marchers increases the probability of action by around 5% to 6%. Sato and Hazelwood. The data indicate that the relationship between the amount of pro-gun control participants in a protest and the probability of the state government acting because of it is positive and significant in statistical terms. So in this specific case, there was an increased chance of action by the government when more people showed up. People protesting work together to urge these changes, and it has been done before. As mentioned in the introduction, the March for Our Lives campaign helped pass 180 gun control laws and even urged younger people to get into the voting booths for the 2020 election. So from the same impact report from 2020, data showed that from the 2016 election to the 2020 election, there's about an 8% increase that the projections of total votes were young voters. So this overall shows how organizations like March for Our Lives can influence society and once again the impact they have on changing issues. So throughout this speech, I made 3 arguments to how protesting could be one of the best ways to participate in civic engagement. The first point was protesting can lead to positive impacts on the participants. Participating in the protests themselves can make people feel like they belong, and the skills they acquire can impact other people for the better. Secondly, I argued that protesting brings awareness to an issue within a community or even society. Issues such as gun control and inequality are a constant issue in our society. Through protesting, though, these issues can be brought into the spotlight where more people can be informed. Finally, protests have been able to bring changes on a political level. If a protest is successful enough and gains enough attention, officials can be pushed to make changes to our society. Each of these arguments relate to protesting, a form of civic engagement that brings people together to fight against an issue and bring change to society. Ellen C. Hope, the author of the article Rethinking Civic Engagement, emphasizes that our democracy is, quote, where citizens elect public officials and those officials are responsive to the views and needs of the people, end quote. With that, it is extremely important for the people of our country to advocate for issues in our society. One of those ways can be through protesting, which can almost include anyone. So think about participating in peaceful protests or even just be aware of the ones going around you. You'll never know the impact that you can bring to society if you participate or get informed about an issue.